Morning, everyone. I'm pretty sure that all of us would agree this morning as we wake up that grace is the most beautiful truth in all of the world. And yet I wonder how many of us would also acknowledge that it can also be very frustrating. It's a beautiful truth because it tells us of how Christ stooped down to meet us in our rebellion and to rescue us and treat us with mercy when all that we deserved was justice and judgment because of our rebellion. Grace is also the ongoing work of God, isn't it? That doesn't treat us as we deserve, but instead drives us forward in our sanctification. So how can that possibly be frustrating? Well, grace is wonderful for us when we receive God's favour. But what about those people that we might deem to be more sinful than us, perhaps more lazy than us, and yet their lives are smoother than ours, and they seem to receive more patience from God than us? Then grace feels so unfair. There appears to be an inequality in grace. I think it's surprising how little we really understand grace, and therefore it's no surprise that so many of the parables that Christ told dealt with this apparent unfairness of grace. One of these is found in Matthew 20 verses 1 to 16. Just before Jesus told the parable there, his disciple Peter had said to him, "See, we have left everything and followed you. What then will we have?" Peter and the disciples longed for fairness in grace. They had worked harder than anyone. They'd risked their lives in following Jesus. They'd travelled the country proclaiming the kingdom. So they wanted to be assured that they would receive their just rewards for doing more than others and starting earlier in the kingdom than others. So in Matthew 20, Jesus tells them this story of an owner of a vineyard. Each day, workers would queue in the marketplace seeking for a job for that day. And then the owner would go down into the marketplace, he'd look around and he would choose whoever he decided. Well, on this day, he gathers a group together of labourers and he agrees with them a fair wage for the day, a denarius for a day's work. And off they go at 6 a.m. to work hard for the next 12 hours. But then the owner decides that he needs more workers, so he goes back at 9 a.m, then midday, then 3 a.m, and finally at 5 a.m, 1 hour before the end of the working day, and chooses more workers for the vineyard. And this is where grace gets frustrating. He pays them all a denarius, whether they worked for 12 hours or 1 hour. Now, of course, grace wasn't frustrating for those who worked for 1 hour, but for those who had worked for 12 hours, they grumbled and complained. They had forgotten that 12 hours previously, they were so thankful for the grace of the owner, who had sovereignly come and given them a job and called them into the vineyard. They'd forgotten the owner's undeserved mercy to them that had provided food for their family for that day. Grace had been the most beautiful thing to them at 6 a.m. But at 6 p.m, it had become the most frustrating thing, as they took their eyes off what the owner had done for them and instead began looking what the owner had done for others. The whole parable is bracketed by Jesus saying, "The last will be first, and the first will be last." Grace upends all that we think justice requires. But think of Jesus, the eternal and glorious King of Kings. And yet, though he was first of all, he came to earth not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. He, the truly first, became last in order that us last, slaves to sin, might be rescued. In him becoming the servant of all, mercy and justice meet and give us the grace that we don't deserve, that wonderful, overflowing, undeserved love of God. And so this is the way of Christ's kingdom. It's an upside down way of life. It's a grace-filled way of life, where we are pleased when anyone comes to know Christ as Saviour, no matter how late in the day. When people who have hurt us or harmed us, and yet God still seems to be loving them without bounds or reticence. When others we consider lazy or foolish still enjoy the kindness and patience of God, Jesus calls us to respond in two ways in Matthew 20, verses 14 and 15. Firstly, he says, remember who is the sovereign owner of the vineyard, who is working out what is right for his church and his world by grace, whether we understand that or not. He says there, I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Remember who is sovereign and knows what is best. And secondly, he urges us to understand what grace really means, that God gives none of us what we deserve. He says there, do you begrudge my generosity? So as we go into today, we mustn't be frustrated by grace, but instead be humbled by the undeserved kindness of God to us. We deserved nothing from him, and yet he has given to us himself and his home. We must also be thankful for God's grace to us, that Christ ever looked on us and sovereignly loved us and gave himself for us.